A shy boy, constantly laughed at by his peers, delivered a speech that left everyone completely stunned. He was known as Ghost Boy. The kid so painfully quiet that some students wondered if he could speak at all. For years, Ethan Parker endured the snickers and sideways glances every time a teacher called his name, only to be met with silence. What his classmates didn't realize was that behind that silence lay a voice more powerful than anyone could have imagined. One that would soon leave an entire auditorium in shocked disbelief. This is the story of how the most overlooked student in school delivered 5 minutes of truth that no one saw coming. Ethan Parker had perfected the art of invisibility long before he reached high school. In elementary school, he was just the quiet kid, the one teachers would occasionally forget when taking attendance. By middle school, the whispers had started, growing louder with each passing semester. By freshman year at Westlake High, he had earned the nickname that followed him through the halls like a shadow. Ghost Boy, a moniker that stung more than anyone realized. He always chose the same seat. Back row, far corner, half hidden by the flag stand or supply cabinet. His routine never varied, eyes down, hoodie up, shoulders hunched as if trying to physically shrink from existence. When teachers called on him, the silence that followed was so uncomfortable that eventually most stopped trying. The rare substitute teacher who didn't know better would occasionally put him on the spot, leading to painful moments of stillness that seemed to stretch into eternity. What no one knew was that Ethan's silence wasn't a choice. The words were always there, trapped behind a wall of anxiety so powerful it felt like his throat would close at the mere thought of speaking in front of others. His mind raced with things to say, intelligent observations, witty comments, thoughtful questions. But his voice remained prisoner to a fear he couldn't explain or control. In his dreams, he spoke freely, confidently, addressing crowds with eloquence that disappeared upon waking. At home, his parents watched helplessly as their once talkative child retreated further into himself with each passing year. They remembered the energetic kindergartner who couldn't stop chattering about dinosaurs and space, now replaced by a teenager who communicated primarily through nods and shrugs. The specialists had names for it: selective mutism, social anxiety disorder, communication apprehension. But labels didn't help Ethan when Jordan Matthews and his friends made throat-cutting gestures whenever he walked by, or when Ms. Winters sighed with that familiar mixture of pity and frustration before calling on someone else. The school counselor had tried various interventions, but nothing seemed to break through the invisible barrier. His few friends, mostly fellow outcasts, who understood the comfort of silence, never pressured him to speak. They created a protective circle around him at lunch, filling the air with enough conversation that his quietness went unnoticed. Only Elena, his lab partner since sophomore year, seemed to sense the storm of words building inside him. "You don't have to talk," she once whispered after he'd frozen during a presentation. "But someday, when you're ready, I think you'll have something important to say." Until the day Mr. Collins announced the senior speech competition, mandatory participation, no exceptions. And Ethan realized his carefully constructed invisibility was about to be shattered. The announcement sent a jolt of pure terror through his body, his hands instantly going clammy as the room seemed to spin around him. 5 minutes on any topic of their choosing, worth 30% of their final grade. As classmates groaned or excitedly discussed potential topics, Ethan felt the walls closing in. This wasn't just another class presentation he could take an F on. This was the difference between graduation and failure. That night, staring at his bedroom ceiling, Ethan made a decision. If he had to speak, if there was truly no escape, Then perhaps it was time the school heard what Ghost Boy had been thinking all these years. Perhaps it was time they heard everything. The announcement of the senior speech competition triggered something unexpected in Ethan. For 3 days following Mr. Collins' bombshell, he barely slept. His mind raced with a toxic mixture of dread and something else, something that felt strangely like opportunity. During those sleepless nights, he found himself mentally composing sentences, paragraphs even, imagining what it might feel like to actually say them aloud. Words that had been buried for years suddenly demanded release, like water pressing against a weakening dam. His parents noticed the change immediately. At dinner, they caught him mouthing words to himself, stopping abruptly when he realized they were watching. His mother found him standing before the bathroom mirror at midnight, lips moving silently as he stared at his reflection with an intensity she hadn't seen in years. When she asked if everything was okay, he simply nodded and closed the door. Later, she confided in her husband that for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Something was shifting in their son, though whether for better or worse remained uncertain. The deadline to submit speech topics was approaching, and Mr. Collins had been calling students alphabetically to announce their choices. Each day, Ethan watched the roster shrink, knowing his turn was coming. Parker. The name sat in the middle of the alphabet. Not enough time to prepare, but not enough time to forget about it either. The perfect purgatory. He observed his classmates' casual attitudes toward the assignment with a mixture of envy and bewilderment. How could something so terrifying to him be so trivial to others? You could talk about space exploration, Elena suggested during lab, carefully measuring hydrochloric acid while avoiding eye contact, knowing direct attention made him uncomfortable. You've got all those books about NASA. Or maybe something about classic literature. You're always reading those old novels nobody else understands. She paused, then added softly, or you could talk about music. I've seen your playlist when you forget to lock your screen. Pretty impressive range from classical to indie rock. Ethan appreciated her attempts, but she didn't understand. This wasn't about finding a safe topic. If he was going to endure the torture of standing before 60 pairs of eyes, feeling the weight of their judgment and anticipation, then the words had to matter. They had to be worth the pain. He'd spent too many years in silence to waste his voice on something trivial. The thought surprised him. When had he started thinking of his voice as something valuable rather than something to hide? In English class, he watched as Marissa Chen confidently announced her topic on environmental sustainability, followed by Derek Foster's predictable choice of college sports recruitment ethics. Every topic selection seemed to reinforce the social hierarchy of Westlake High. The popular discussing the relevant, the academic elite choosing intellectual challenges, the rebels picking controversial subjects. Where did that leave him? What did Ghost Boy have to contribute that anyone would want to hear? The breaking point came on Thursday afternoon. Jordan Matthews and two of his friends, Tyler Ramirez and Scott Donovan, cornered Ethan near the band room after final bell. "Hey, Ghost Boy," Jordan called, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "Heard you're giving a speech next week. What's that going to sound like? 5 minutes of this?" He proceeded to mime opening and closing his mouth like a fish, while his friends doubled over with laughter. "Maybe he'll just stand there and wet himself," Tyler suggested, setting off another round of hilarity. "Remember when he had to read that poem in freshman year? I thought Mrs. Davidson was going to have a stroke waiting for him to start." "Seriously, though," Jordan said, stepping closer, the faint smell of mint gum and expensive cologne invading Ethan's space. You know Collins won't pass you if you don't actually speak, right? Guess you'll be the first senior to fail because you're too much of a freak to open your mouth. Something shifted inside Ethan in that moment. A fault line finally giving way after years of pressure. The words that had been building for so long suddenly felt too powerful to contain. His hands curled into fists, not out of aggression, but from the effort of holding back the flood. He felt a strange heat rising from his chest to his neck, a physical manifestation of years of suppressed thoughts and feelings. When Jordan shoved his shoulder with a dismissive, "See you at graduation." "Oh, wait, no, we won't." Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he looked directly into Jordan's eyes for perhaps the first time ever. The unexpected eye contact made Jordan step back, momentarily confused by this deviation from the established script. For a brief second, something like uncertainty flickered across the popular boy's face. "What are you looking at?" Jordan demanded, his voice slightly less confident. Ethan held his gaze for 3 more seconds before turning away, leaving Jordan calling after him, "That's right, keep walking. Not like you've got anything to say anyway." But he did have something to say. For the first time in years, Ethan felt certain of that fact. That night, Ethan sat at his desk until dawn, filling page after page with words that had been trapped inside him for years. When his alarm went off, he had 37 handwritten pages and bloodshot eyes. The words had poured out in a torrent. Observations about the social ecosystem of high school. Reflections on the power of silence and voice. Thoughts on how people use words as both shields and weapons. He wrote about the teachers who had given up on him and the few who hadn't. About the cruelty that hid behind casual jokes. And about the strange courage it sometimes took to remain silent when everyone demanded you speak. He selected 5 pages, placed them in a folder, and for the first time in recent memory, walked to school with his head up. His mother, pouring coffee in the kitchen, nearly dropped her mug when she saw him coming downstairs without his hoodie pulled over his head. "Ethan, are you feeling all right?" she asked, instinctively reaching to check for a fever. He nodded, actually making eye contact with her, before grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl. "I'm fine," he said quietly, just 2 words, but enough to make her eyes widen in surprise. The school day passed in a blur until 5th period English. When Mr. Collins called Parker Ethan that morning, the classroom fell into its usual awkward silence. But instead of the painful pause everyone expected, Ethan cleared his throat and said in a voice rusty from disuse, but surprisingly steady, "The invisible majority." The classroom went completely still, not from the usual second-hand embarrassment, but from shock at hearing his voice at all. Jordan Matthews's head snapped up from his phone, his expression comically confused. Mr. Collins recovered first. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that, Ethan?" he asked, adjusting his glasses as if they might be malfunctioning. "My speech topic," Ethan said, each word slightly stronger than the last. "It's called the invisible majority." "The invisible majority," Mr. Collins repeated slowly, as if processing not just the words, but the fact that they had come from Ethan Parker. "That's an intriguing title. Can you give us a brief description of what you'll be addressing?" In the past, this follow-up question would have been enough to send Ethan spiraling into panic. Today, however, he took a deep breath and replied, "It's about the people we don't hear from. The ones who stay silent even when they have the most to say." A murmur rippled through the classroom. Someone in the back whispered loudly, "Did Ghost Boy just speak in full sentences?" Followed by a shushing sound. As Mr. Collins wrote it down, nodding with obvious surprise, Ethan caught Elena's eye from across the room. She was smiling, but not with amusement, with something that looked remarkably like pride. She gave him a small thumbs up, which he acknowledged with the slightest nod. That weekend, Ethan practiced his speech in empty parks, abandoned parking lots, and finally, in front of his astonished parents, who sat in stunned silence as their son's voice filled their living room for the first time in years. His father had tears streaming down his face by the end, while his mother kept covering her mouth with her hands, as if afraid any reaction might break the spell. "Ethan," his father said when he finished, voice thick with emotion. I don't even have words." "Where did this come from?" his mother asked, reaching for his hand but stopping short, uncertain if he would welcome the contact. "I mean, we always knew you were thoughtful, but this is powerful," his father finished. "Son, people need to hear this." Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with their praise, but not rejecting it entirely. "Maybe they do," he said quietly. "Maybe that's why I finally have to say it." On Sunday night, he practiced one final time in front of his bedroom mirror, watching his own expressions, forcing himself to maintain eye contact with his reflection. The speech wasn't perfect. His voice still trembled at parts, and he occasionally lost his place. But the words were exactly what needed to be said. And on Monday, when his turn came, Ethan Parker would make sure everyone heard them. As he finally lay down to sleep, a strange calm had replaced the anxiety that had been his constant companion for years. Tomorrow would be terrifying. Tomorrow might be humiliating. But tomorrow, Ghost Boy would finally speak. And perhaps, in finding his voice, he might help others find theirs as well. Monday morning arrived with the kind of perfect clarity that seems reserved for pivotal days. Sunlight streamed through Ethan's bedroom window, casting long shadows across his floor and illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. He had slept surprisingly well, as if his body recognized the need for rest before the coming challenge. His alarm clock read 6:17 a.m. He'd woken before the buzzer, something that hadn't happened in years. The speech folder sat on his desk where he'd left it. 5 pages of carefully selected words that represented more than just an assignment. They were his declaration of existence. His hand trembled slightly as he placed the folder in his backpack, a physical reminder of the anxiety that still coursed through his system despite his newfound determination. He ran his fingers over the worn canvas of his backpack, wondering if people would remember this as the day Ghost Boy finally spoke, or just another humiliating chapter in his high school story. Downstairs, he found both his parents in the kitchen, an unusual sight on a weekday morning. His mother was making pancakes, his favorite breakfast from childhood that he hadn't requested in years. His father sat at the table reading the news on his tablet, but set it aside immediately when Ethan entered. "You're going to do great today," his mother said at breakfast, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the hopeful tremor in her voice. His father, normally gone before Ethan came downstairs, had delayed his departure to share this morning meal. "Whatever happens," his father added, "we're proud of you for trying." He hesitated, then continued. "I know we haven't always understood what you've been going through, Ethan, but we've always believed in you, even when it seemed like you'd given up on yourself." The naked emotion in his father's voice made Ethan uncomfortable, but also touched something deep inside him. He nodded, grateful for their support, but unable to articulate how their expectations added another layer of pressure. What if he froze? What if, after building everyone's hopes, he reverted to Ghost Boy when the moment came. The thought made his stomach clench, and he managed only 2 bites of pancake before pushing his plate away. "Sorry," he murmured when his mother's face fell. "Just nervous." "Of course you are," she said quickly. "That's normal. Everyone gets nervous before public speaking. But not everyone has spent the last 6 years in almost complete silence," he thought, but didn't say. Not everyone has become defined by their inability to speak. The walk to school felt like marching toward an execution. Each step brought him closer to the moment of truth. The familiar route seemed altered somehow. Colors more vivid, sounds more distinct, as if his senses were heightened by the adrenaline already flowing through his system. He noticed details he'd overlooked for years. The intricate pattern of bark on the old oak tree at the corner, the melodic quality of a cardinal's morning song, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating dappled patterns on the sidewalk. By the time he reached the school parking lot, his shirt was already damp with nervous sweat despite the cool morning air. Elena was waiting by his locker, her face lighting up when she spotted him. Unlike most days when she respected his desire for minimal interaction, today she approached directly, her curly hair bouncing with each step. "Today's the day," she said, falling into step beside him as he navigated the crowded hallway. "Are you ready?" He managed a tight nod, focusing on the combination lock, turning the dial with more concentration than necessary. "You know," she continued, seemingly undeterred by his minimal response, "I've been thinking about your topic. The invisible majority. It's perfect for you." She lowered her voice, leaning slightly closer. "And not just for you. There are a lot of us who feel invisible for different reasons. Maria feels invisible because English isn't her first language. Devin feels invisible because he's not athletic in a school obsessed with sports. I feel invisible sometimes because—" She paused, surprising Ethan with this personal admission. "Because being the smart girl means people see the brain, but not the person. I think people need to hear what you have to say." Her words echoed his father's from the night before, adding weight to his purpose. Perhaps this wasn't just about him finding his voice. Perhaps it was about representing all those who couldn't or wouldn't speak. The thought simultaneously terrified and strengthened him. "Thanks," he managed to say, the word coming out rougher than intended. Elena's eyebrows shot up in surprise at his verbal response, but she quickly composed herself. "Just speak from the heart," she said, giving his arm a quick squeeze before heading to her first class. That's where the truest words come from. First period calculus passed in a blur. Ms. Abernathy's lecture on differential equations registered as nothing more than background noise, as Ethan mentally rehearsed his speech. Second period history was equally lost on him. Though he noticed Mr. Gonzalez giving him concerned glances, perhaps interpreting his distraction as his usual withdrawal rather than the nervous anticipation it actually was. Mr. Collins had arranged the speech schedule alphabetically, which placed Ethan squarely in the middle of the pack. He would be the third presenter after lunch, following Olivia Ngoyen and before James Peterson. As he sat through morning classes, time seemed to alternate between racing forward and crawling painfully slow. The clock on the wall became his enemy and his obsession, each tick bringing him closer to the moment that would either liberate or destroy him. By lunch period, word had spread that Ghost Boy was actually planning to speak. He could feel the curious glances, hear the speculative whispers. A sophomore girl he'd never spoken to stopped by his usual isolated table. "Is it true?" she asked without preamble. "You're really doing the speech?" When he nodded, she smiled. "Cool. Good luck." She walked away before he could process the unexpected interaction. Jordan Matthews made a point of walking by his table, making exaggerated throat-clearing sounds before laughing with his friends. "Better stock up on water, ghost boy," he called over his shoulder. "Wouldn't want your throat to get dry after all this time not using it." Ethan kept his eyes on his untouched sandwich, focusing on controlling his breathing as Jordan's friends snickered. The familiar urge to disappear, to pull his hoodie tighter and shrink into invisibility, washed over him. But beneath that familiar response, a new feeling was building. Not quite anger, but something like determination. Jordan's mockery was exactly why his speech mattered. When the bell rang signaling fifth period English, his legs felt like lead as he made his way to Mr. Collins' classroom. The hallway seemed longer than usual, stretching endlessly before him. Other students rushed past, laughing and talking, seemingly unburdened by the weight that pressed down on his shoulders. The classroom was buzzing with nervous energy as students arranged note cards and practiced under their breath. Some paced in small circles by their desks, while others sat with eyes closed, mouthing silent words. "At least I'm not the only one afraid," Ethan thought, finding unexpected comfort in the shared anxiety. Mr. Collins was setting up the video camera in the back of the room. All speeches would be recorded for grading purposes, adding another layer of pressure. The red recording light seemed to glare at Ethan like a malevolent eye. "All right, settle down, everyone," Mr. Collins called as the final bell rang. He was wearing his formal outfit today, a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches that the students secretly mocked, but also found endearing. "As you know, we have 6 presenters today. Let's give each speaker our full attention and respect." His eyes lingered meaningfully on Jordan's corner of the room, where the popular crowd had already claimed territory. Remember that public speaking is consistently rated as one of humanity's greatest fears, ahead of heights, confined spaces, and even death in some surveys. So showing respect isn't just good manners, it's an act of empathy. He consulted his roster. "Olivia Nguyen, you're up first." Olivia, president of the debate team and widely expected to be valedictorian, strode confidently to the front of the room. Her speech on representation in media was well-researched and confidently delivered, complete with statistics and personal anecdotes that kept the class engaged. When she concluded with a call to action for more diverse voices in entertainment, the class applauded politely. Next came Oliver Nance, with a passionate argument about school funding inequities. His hands moved expressively as he described the stark differences between Westlake High and the public schools just 20 miles east. Again, respectful applause followed his conclusion, with Mr. Collins offering brief but encouraging feedback. "Ethan Parker," Mr. Collins called, and the room fell silent in a way it hadn't for the previous speakers. The quality of the silence was different, charged with curiosity and anticipation. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as he stood, folder clutched in his trembling hand. The walk to the front of the room felt endless, each step echoing in his ears. He could feel every eye on him, could sense the collective anticipation. Some looked eager for entertainment, waiting for the crash and burn. Others seemed genuinely curious. Elena gave him an encouraging smile from her seat near the window, where sunlight illuminated her face in a way that momentarily distracted him from his terror. As he turned to face the class, the room seemed to swim before his eyes. 30 faces stared back at him, some bored, some curious, some already smirking in anticipation of his failure. His mouth went dry. The familiar tightness gripped his throat. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he might actually pass out. This was a mistake. "I can't do this. I can't." His eyes fell on the first line of his speech, words he had written in a moment of clarity. The loudest voices aren't always the most important ones. He took a deep breath. And then Ethan Parker began to speak. The loudest voices aren't always the most important ones, he said, his voice quiet but clear in the silent room. Sometimes, the most crucial things are said by those who speak the least. He paused, looking up from his paper to scan the room. The smirks had faded, replaced by expressions of surprise and curiosity. In the back row, he noticed Jordan Matthews sitting up straighter, phone forgotten in his hand. We live in a world that rewards volume. The shouters, the interrupters, the constant commentators. We mistake noise for confidence, for authority, for truth. But what about the rest of us? The watchers? The listeners? The ones who choose words carefully, or sometimes not at all? His voice grew stronger with each sentence, the years of silence giving way to a flow of words that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. The initial tremor faded, replaced by a resonance that filled the classroom. There's an invisible majority in every classroom, every workplace, every social gathering. People who have thoughts, ideas, and perspectives that never get heard. Not because they have nothing to say, but because the space to say it is taken up by those who can't stand the sound of silence. As he continued, he found himself making eye contact with classmates, something he'd avoided for years. He saw recognition in some faces, discomfort in others. Jordan Matthews shifted in his seat, suddenly fascinated by his shoelaces. Near the window, Maria Diaz was nodding slightly, her eyes bright with understanding. When you don't speak, Ethan continued, his confidence growing, people create narratives about you. They decide you're stuck up or stupid, weird or worthless. They fill your silence with their assumptions. I've been called Ghost Boy for so long that some of you probably don't remember my actual name is Ethan. A nervous titter rippled through the class at this direct acknowledgement of his nickname. Mr. Collins frowned slightly, but didn't interrupt. I've been silent for so long that people stopped expecting me to speak. I became a ghost, present but not acknowledged. And in that invisibility, I saw things others missed. I noticed how Liam Stewart helps his younger sister with her homework every morning in the library because their parents work early shifts. I observed how Ms. Winters always brings an extra lunch for Caitlin Morris, who never has her own. I watched Jordan Matthews cry in his car after his basketball team lost the championship, though he laughed it off with his friends minutes later. A gasp rippled through the room at this revelation. Jordan's head snapped up, his face flushing red. For a moment, Ethan feared he'd gone too far, but he pressed on. The point isn't to embarrass anyone, Ethan continued, his voice gentle but firm. The point is that silence can be a window as much as a wall. Those of us who don't speak are still here, still human, still noticing. And sometimes, what we see matters. He turned a page, his hand steadier now. There's a difference between being quiet and being silenced. Some of us choose quiet. It's where we feel most ourselves, most able to think clearly. Others are silenced by fear, by trauma, by systems that weren't built for our voices. Both experiences deserve respect, not mockery or erasure. As he moved through his speech, Ethan felt something shifting in the room and within himself. The trembling in his hands subsided. His voice found its natural rhythm. The words he had rehearsed alone in his room now filled the space, commanding attention not through volume, but through their truth. In elementary school, I talked all the time, he revealed, departing slightly from his prepared text. I had opinions about everything, dinosaurs, space, why the cafeteria should serve pizza every day. Then in 4th grade, I gave a presentation on hawks. I was excited. I'd spent weeks researching. But halfway through, Tyler Wilson started making hawk screeches every time I turned to change slides. He paused, surprised by his own willingness to share this memory. Everyone laughed. Even the teacher smiled before telling him to stop. And something in me just broke. Not all at once, but gradually, like a crack spreading through glass. Each time I tried to speak after that, I remembered the laughter. Eventually, it seemed easier not to try. The confession hung in the air. Several students looked down, perhaps recognizing their own roles in similar stories. Tyler Wilson, now a senior like Ethan, slouched lower in his seat. "There are many reasons people go quiet," he said, nearing his conclusion. "Fear, trauma, difference, calculation. But whatever the cause, our silence doesn't make us less. Sometimes it makes us more observant, more thoughtful, more aware of the power of words." He looked directly at his classmates now, no longer needing to refer to his notes. His voice had found its strength, not loud, but clear and steady. "So the next time you notice the quiet ones, remember, we see you, we hear you, and if you took the time to listen, you might discover that we have something valuable to say. The invisible majority is only invisible because you've trained yourself not to look." He paused, then added words that weren't in his original draft. "And to the others who stay silent, for whatever reason, know this. Your voice matters, even if you never choose to use it. But if you do decide to speak, there are people who will listen. I didn't believe that until today. Now I do." The silence that followed his final words was profound. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then, from the back of the room, Elena stood and began to applaud. Slowly, others joined her until the entire class was on their feet. Even Jordan Matthews stood, though his expression was unreadable. Mr. Collins wiped something suspiciously like a tear from behind his glasses. "That," he said when the applause finally died down, "is why we do this assignment every year. Thank you, Ethan." As Ethan returned to his seat, legs shaky with adrenaline and relief, classmates reached out to touch his shoulder, to murmur congratulations. Maria Diaz whispered, "Gracias," as he passed her desk, her eyes communicating a deeper gratitude than the word alone could convey. Even Jordan gave him a grudging nod of acknowledgement. The remaining speeches passed in a blur. James Peterson discussed sports psychology with his usual athletic confidence. Priya Patel delivered a thoughtful analysis of social media's impact on teenage mental health. Sam Quincy closed the day with an impassioned plea for environmental action. All were well done, but Ethan noticed the class still seemed to be processing his words, with conversations during transitions frequently circling back to points he'd made. When the bell rang, Ethan gathered his things, feeling drained but strangely peaceful. The emotional exhaustion was real. He felt as if he'd run a marathon, but beneath it was a sense of accomplishment unlike anything he'd experienced before. As students filed out, many stopped to comment on his speech, expressing surprise and admiration. Words like powerful and never knew floated around him. Caitlin Morris, who he'd mentioned in his speech, touched his arm gently. "Thanks for seeing me," she said simply before disappearing into the hallway crowd. Mr. Collins asked him to stay behind for a moment. When the room had emptied, the teacher sat on the edge of his desk, regarding Ethan with new eyes. "In 20 years of teaching, that was one of the most authentic speeches I've ever heard," he said simply. You found your voice today, Ethan, and I have a feeling we'll be hearing much more from you in the future. Ethan nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Maybe, he said, his voice quiet but no longer silent. Maybe you will. I hope so, Mr. Collins replied. But I also want you to know that what you said about voice mattering even in silence, that resonated deeply with me. My younger brother is autistic and minimally verbal. People often mistake his silence for absence, but he's one of the most present, perceptive people I know. This personal revelation surprised Ethan. Teachers rarely shared their lives outside school. That's why I never pushed you to speak when you weren't ready, Mr. Collins continued. But I'm glad you found your moment. This speech deserves a wider audience, Ethan. Would you consider submitting it to the school literary magazine? Or perhaps delivering it at an assembly? The thought of speaking before an even larger crowd sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Ethan. But it wasn't the paralyzing fear of before. It was the normal nervousness anyone might feel. Daunting, but not devastating. I'll think about it, he promised, meaning it. As he left the classroom, he spotted Elena waiting in the hallway. She was leaning against the wall, scrolling through her phone, but looked up immediately when the door opened. So, she said, falling into step beside him as they navigated the now emptying hallway. Ghost Boy speaks, and the whole school listens. How does it feel? Ethan considered the question seriously. Like waking up, he finally answered. Like finally waking up. Well, you certainly woke everyone else up too, she said with a grin. I've never seen Jordan Matthews speechless before. That alone was worth the price of admission. Ethan smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. That wasn't the point, but I won't pretend it wasn't satisfying. They pushed through the main doors into the afternoon sunlight. The day was still beautiful, but now Ethan felt part of it rather than separate from it. What now? Elena asked as they paused at the point where their paths home diverged. It was a simple question with complex implications. What came after breaking 6 years of silence? What happened when Ghost Boy became visible? The future stretched before him, uncertain but suddenly full of possibilities that hadn't existed this morning. Now, Ethan said, his voice growing stronger with each word. I keep talking. Not all the time, not unnecessarily. But when I have something worth saying, I say it. I like that plan, Elena replied. She hesitated, then added, Some of us have been waiting a long time to hear what you have to say, Ethan Parker. As they parted ways, Ethan felt the weight of his backpack, still containing the speech folder. The words he'd written were now in the open, released into the world. They couldn't be taken back. And for the first time in years, he didn't want to take anything back. Ghost Boy had spoken, and the world, or at least his small corner of it, had listened. The following days after Ethan's speech unfolded like a series of cascading ripples, each one echoing in the hallways of Westlake High. The initial shock of his words lingered, transforming into conversations that buzzed through the corridors, igniting something more than just curiosity. They ignited a movement. Ethan walked into school the day after his speech, greeted by a wave of unexpected camaraderie. Classmates he had never interacted with before nodded in acknowledgement, some even smiling warmly as he passed. It was a strange and exhilarating feeling, the sensation of being seen. For years he had navigated the school like a shadow, but now he was stepping into the light, and it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Elena was waiting for him at his locker, her expression bright with excitement. "You won't believe the conversations happening on social media about your speech," she said, leaning against the lockers. "People are sharing their own stories of feeling invisible. It's like you opened a floodgate." Ethan felt a rush of conflicting emotions. He had hoped his words would resonate, but the reality of it, the way his vulnerability had sparked something in others, was overwhelming. "Really? I didn't think it would have that much of an impact." "Of course it did. You spoke about things people are too afraid to say out loud. It's empowering," she said, her eyes shining. "A couple of students even approached Mr. Collins about organizing a Voices of Westlake event where anyone can share their stories." The idea sent a thrill of anxiety through him. A public gathering where anyone could speak? The thought of being in a room full of voices, competing for attention, made his stomach churn. But beneath that anxiety was a flicker of excitement. Perhaps this was the beginning of something important, a chance to foster understanding and connection among students who had felt alone. "That sounds intense," Ethan replied cautiously. "Do you really think people would want to hear more stories?" "Absolutely. You've already inspired so many," Elena insisted, looking genuinely thrilled by the prospect. "I mean, look at how many people were moved by your speech. They want to connect, to share, and to hear from others just like you." "You've started something here, Ethan." Classes flew by in a blur as he tried to absorb the impact of his speech. At lunch, he found himself seated with a group that included some familiar faces and a few he didn't recognize. They talked about everything from summer plans to college applications, and for the first time, Ethan felt like he belonged. The conversation flowed more easily, and he found himself laughing and contributing rather than just observing. Jordan Matthews, who had been a thorn in his side for years, approached him during lunch, flanked by his usual entourage. Ethan braced himself for the inevitable mockery, but Jordan surprised him. "Hey, Parker," he said, his tone unexpectedly serious. "I just wanted to say, that speech was actually pretty good. Like, really good. I didn't know you had it in you." Ethan blinked, taken aback. Thanks," he replied, unsure how to process this sudden shift. Had Jordan actually meant it? Or was this just a setup for another joke? Jordan continued, "I mean, I've been thinking about it a lot. You made some good points. Maybe we all have a bit of the invisible majority in us. Just thought you should know." "All right." Ethan managed a small smile. "I appreciate that." As Jordan walked away, Ethan felt a mix of relief and confusion. Had Jordan really changed? Or was this just a fleeting moment of introspection? Either way, it seemed like the ripple effect of his speech was reaching even the most unexpected corners of the school. The next day, he received an email from Mr. Collins, requesting a meeting during lunch. When he arrived at the English classroom, he found the teacher sitting at his desk, a stack of papers in front of him. "Thanks for coming, Ethan," Mr. Collins said with a warm smile. "I wanted to discuss the Voices of Westlake event we're planning. Your speech has inspired a lot of students to share their stories, and I believe you should play a pivotal role in it." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. "You want me to speak again?" he asked, anxiety creeping in. "Not just to speak," Mr. Collins replied, leaning forward. "I think you should help organize it. You have a unique perspective and a voice that resonates with your peers. You could be the one to encourage others to step up and share their stories." A mix of fear and excitement washed over Ethan. The idea of organizing an event felt monumental, but a part of him longed to rise to the challenge. I don't know if I'm ready for that, he admitted. You don't have to be perfect, Mr. Collins assured him. This is about creating a safe space for everyone to express themselves. You could facilitate discussions, help decide on a format, and bring in students who want to share. You've already proven you can inspire others. Ethan considered this, his mind racing. The implications of such a role were daunting, but the thought of helping others find their voices, like he had, ignited something within him. Okay, he said finally, feeling the resolve settle in his chest. I'll do it. Great, Mr. Collins beamed. We'll start planning during lunch, and I can connect you with the student council to help with promotion. This could really turn into something special. As Ethan left the classroom, he felt the weight of his decision settle into place. He was no longer just Ghost Boy. He was becoming a catalyst for change. The idea of leading an event terrified him, but it also thrilled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He couldn't wait to see how many voices would rise to fill the space he had begun to carve out for himself and others. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of planning and excitement. Ethan, with Elena's unwavering support, organized meetings with interested students, brainstormed ideas for themes, and worked with Mr. Collins to secure a date and venue. They decided on a Friday afternoon in the auditorium, a space that had seen countless performances and speeches. But none quite like this. Word spread through the school, and students began to express interest in sharing their stories. Some approached Ethan directly, sharing their experiences of feeling overlooked or misunderstood. Each conversation deepened his appreciation for the diversity of experiences at Westlake High and fueled his determination to create a safe space for everyone. The day of the event arrived with an electric atmosphere. Students filed into the auditorium, the buzz of conversation mingling with the excitement and nervousness in the air. The stage was set with a simple microphone stand and a few chairs arranged in a circle. Ethan stood near the entrance, welcoming students and directing them to their seats. When the clock struck 3, Mr. Collins took the stage, introducing the event and emphasizing the importance of sharing one's voice. Ethan's heart raced as he listened to the encouraging words of his teacher, knowing he would soon take the stage himself. One by one, students began to share their stories. Each voice added a new layer to the tapestry of experience within the room. There were stories of triumph and struggle, of overcoming obstacles and confronting fears. Maria spoke about her journey as an immigrant and the challenges she faced adjusting to a new culture. Sam shared his story of battling anxiety and how it had shaped his high school experience. Even Jordan Matthews surprised everyone by discussing his insecurities and the pressure he felt to maintain his reputation. Ethan sat in the audience, captivated by the bravery of his peers. Each story resonated deeply, and he felt the collective strength in the room growing with every voice that spoke. It was astonishing to see how sharing their truths had an immediate effect on the atmosphere. Laughter punctuated moments of vulnerability, and tears flowed freely during the more poignant narratives. Finally, it was his turn. As he approached the microphone, he felt the familiar flutter of nerves in his stomach. But they were accompanied by a sense of purpose that had grown stronger with each story he had heard. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "My name is Ethan Parker, and I used to be known as Ghost Boy. For years, I was silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was afraid of what would happen if I did. But standing here today, surrounded by all of you, I realized that my silence was a choice I made out of fear, and it kept me from experiencing the fullness of life and connection." He paused, scanning the faces in the audience. Some were nodding and understanding. Others looked intrigued, hanging on to his every word. I've learned that our voices matter. Each one of us has a story worth telling. And when we share those stories, we create bridges of understanding instead of walls of isolation. I want to encourage all of you to find your voices, to share your truths, and to listen to one another. It's in that space of vulnerability that real connection happens. As he spoke, he felt the energy in the room shift. Students were leaning in, captivated by his words. He shared snippets of his own journey, the struggles of feeling invisible, the fear that had kept him silent for so long, and the exhilaration he had felt in finally speaking up. Today, I stand here not just as Ethan Parker, but as a representative of all those who feel unheard, unseen, or invisible. Together, we create a chorus of voices that can no longer be ignored. So let's continue to share, to listen, and to lift each other up. Every voice counts, and together, we can make sure that no one has to feel like a ghost in their own life. The applause that erupted felt like an explosion of energy, reverberating through the auditorium. Ethan stepped back from the mic, overwhelmed by the response. He had faced his fears and spoken from his heart. And the collective energy of the room reflected the power of shared stories. As the event drew to a close, students mingled, sharing their thoughts and reactions, and the auditorium buzzed with newfound connections. Ethan found himself surrounded by Elena and several others who had spoken, their faces aglow with excitement. "You were amazing," Elena exclaimed, her eyes shining. "You really did it, Ethan. Look around. Everyone is talking and connecting." Ethan couldn't help but smile. "I couldn't have done it without all of you." As students continued to share their stories and experiences, Ethan felt a profound sense of belonging wash over him. The invisible majority was beginning to emerge from the shadows, and he realized that their collective power could create real change. Walking out of the auditorium, he felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to embrace it. Together with his classmates, he would continue to share, listen, and create spaces for voices that had been silenced for far too long. Ethan Parker was no longer just a ghost. He was a beacon of hope, illuminating the paths for others to find their voices too. And as he stepped back into the hallways of Westlake High, he understood that this was just the beginning. The weeks following the Voices of Westlake event transformed Ethan's high school experience in ways he had never imagined. The auditorium had become a sacred space, a sanctuary where students shared their stories and found solace in the understanding of their peers. The momentum from that day didn't dissipate. Instead, it grew, creating a ripple effect that touched nearly every corner of Westlake High. Ethan's role in the aftermath of the event evolved naturally. He and Elena became the unofficial ambassadors of the movement, encouraging others to share their experiences and fostering an environment of openness and support. They organized regular meetings where students could come together to talk, brainstorm ideas for future events, and continue exploring the power of storytelling. One afternoon, as they sat in the library surrounded by a mix of familiar and new faces, Ethan felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. The once quiet boy who had navigated the hallways like a shadow was now leading discussions, facilitating conversations, and creating an atmosphere where vulnerability was not just accepted, but celebrated. "I think we should do a theme for our next gathering," Elena suggested, her enthusiasm infectious. "Something that focuses on mental health and self-acceptance. We could invite a local therapist to talk about coping strategies and then have an open mic for sharing personal stories." Ethan nodded, excited by the idea. That's a great idea. Mental health is such an important topic, especially for teenagers. We could even create a resource guide to hand out, with information on local support groups and hotlines. As they brainstormed, Ethan felt a buzz of energy in the room. More and more students were joining their discussions, eager to contribute and share their thoughts. It was a far cry from the days when he had felt so isolated and invisible. Now they were building a community that embraced authenticity and connection. However, with this newfound responsibility came challenges. Not everyone at Westlake was on board with the changes. Some students were resistant to the idea of open discussions about feelings and mental health, seeing it as unnecessary or even weak. Ethan encountered skepticism from some of the more popular students, including a few who had previously bullied him. One day during lunch, he overheard a conversation between a group of seniors seated at the table across from him. "Did you hear about that stupid Voices of Westlake thing?" One of them sneered. "It's just a bunch of whiners looking for attention." Ethan's heart sank, but instead of retreating into silence, he felt a surge of determination. He stood and walked over to their table, surprising even himself. "Actually," he said, his voice steady, "it's about creating a space where people can share their experiences and feel supported. It's not whining, it's about being honest and real. Maybe you should try listening instead of judging." The group stared at him, shock evident on their faces. They were not used to being confronted, especially not by someone they considered beneath them. But Ethan stood his ground, eyeing them with a newfound confidence. After a moment of silence, one of the seniors scoffed, "Whatever, Ghost Boy. You think you're some kind of hero now?" The others laughed, but Ethan could see a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. "I'm not trying to be a hero," he replied calmly. "I'm just trying to make this place better for everyone. Maybe you should try it too." With that, he turned and walked away, heart racing but feeling accomplished. He had stood up for something he believed in, and though it hadn't changed their minds, it had felt empowering to speak his truth. He realized that as he continued to grow and find his voice, others might be compelled to do the same, even if they didn't know it yet. As spring approached, the school buzzed with energy. The weather warmed, and students began to spend more time outside, making the campus feel more vibrant. The success of the previous event inspired Ethan and Elena to plan a larger gathering for Mental Health Awareness Month, to be held in the school's courtyard. They envisioned a festival-like atmosphere, complete with booths for local mental health organizations, art therapy stations, and a stage for open mic performances. In the planning meetings, Ethan found himself increasingly comfortable speaking up and sharing his ideas. He encouraged others to take leadership roles, fostering a sense of ownership among the group. Students who had once been shy or withdrawn began to step forward, eager to contribute their talents and perspectives. One afternoon, as they worked on decorations for the event, Ethan noticed Maria Diaz sketching at the edge of the room. Intrigued, he approached her. "What are you working on?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. Maria looked up, her cheeks slightly flushed. "Oh, it's just some ideas for a mural. I thought we could create a mural for the event that represents our themes of connection and support." "Are you serious? That's an amazing idea," Ethan exclaimed, genuinely impressed. "We should definitely include that in our plans." The mural could serve as a backdrop for the stage and a way for students to express themselves creatively. Encouraged by his enthusiasm, Maria smiled. "Really? You think so?" "Absolutely." "Let's present it to the group," Ethan replied, feeling a rush of excitement. He began to see how each student's unique talents could contribute to the community they were building. When they pitched the mural idea during the next meeting, the group responded enthusiastically. Students began brainstorming themes, colors, and symbols that would represent their collective experiences. The collaborative energy was palpable, and Ethan felt a sense of belonging that filled him with warmth. As the date of the event approached, the excitement in the air intensified. Flyers were posted around the school and word spread on social media. Students began to talk about the upcoming festival, and anticipation grew among those who had previously felt invisible. On the day of the event, the courtyard was transformed into a vibrant space filled with colorful banners, art stations, and information booths. Local mental health organizations set up tables, ready to provide resources and support to students. Laughter and chatter filled the air as students mingled, many of them unfamiliar with the sense of community that had begun to blossom at Westlake. Ethan stood near the entrance, welcoming attendees and directing them to various activities. The sun shone brightly, and he felt a sense of pride swell within him as he observed his classmates engaging with one another, sharing stories, and creating art together. When it was time for the open mic portion, Ethan took a deep breath and stepped up to the stage, his heart racing with excitement and nerves. He had decided to share a new piece he had written, one that encapsulated his journey of finding his voice. "Hi, everyone," he began, looking out at the crowd. "I'm Ethan Parker, and I want to share a poem I wrote called Unseen Threads. It's about the connections we forge when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and honest." As he recited the poem, he could see the faces in the audience shift from curiosity to reflection. He poured his heart into the words, expressing the beauty of shared experiences and the strength found in vulnerability. The crowd listened intently, and as he finished, a wave of applause washed over him. Ethan stepped back from the mic, feeling exhilarated. He had shared a piece of himself, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. He could see students nodding in understanding, some with tears in their eyes, others smiling in recognition of their own struggles. Throughout the rest of the event, various students took to the stage, sharing their stories, poems, and artwork. Each performance added another layer to the tapestry of connection that was being woven in the courtyard. Laughter erupted at jokes, and tears flowed during more poignant stories, creating a beautiful blend of emotions that filled the air. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the courtyard, Ethan felt a sense of fulfillment wash over him. They had created something meaningful, a space where students could express themselves freely, share their experiences, and support one another. When the event wound down and students began to disperse, Ethan found himself surrounded by his friends, including Elena, Maria, and even Jordan, who seemed genuinely engaged in the spirit of the day. "Ethan, that was incredible," Elena said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "You brought everyone together. Look at how many people showed up." Maria chimed in, "And the mural is going to be amazing. I can't wait to see it finished." Jordan, who had been quieter throughout the event, finally spoke up. "You know, I didn't think this would be such a big deal, but I get it now. I really do. I mean, everyone has something to say, and it's cool to hear all these different stories." Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of connection with Jordan that had never existed before. "Thanks, man. It means a lot to hear you say that." As they all stood together, basking in the afterglow of the event, Ethan realized that the journey he had embarked on was far from over. He had found his voice, but there was still so much to explore. New stories to share, new connections to forge, and new challenges to face. In the days that followed, the impact of the festival continued to resonate throughout the school, Students began initiating their own discussions, forming support groups, and reaching out to one another. The invisible majority was being seen, and the culture at Westlake High was beginning to shift toward one of empathy and understanding. Ethan felt a sense of belonging that he had never experienced before. He was no longer just a bystander in his own life. He was an active participant, a leader, and a friend. And as he navigated this new chapter, he understood that every voice mattered, including his own. With each passing day, he felt more empowered to embrace his journey and encourage others to do the same. It was a journey of self-discovery, connection, and resilience. A journey that promised to unfold in ways he had yet to imagine. As he walked through the hallways, he noticed the subtle changes in the atmosphere. Students smiled at one another, shared stories, and formed connections that transcended the previously rigid social hierarchies of high school life. Each interaction felt charged with possibility, and Ethan knew that they were all part of something larger than themselves. Together, they were weaving a new narrative, a narrative of acceptance, understanding, and shared humanity. And in that narrative, Ethan Parker had finally found his place.